Machine guns, bombs, and snipers blasting you to pieces. Chemical weapons that make you vomit up the lining of your throat while you suffocate. U-boats full of scorching heat and rampaging cockroach colonies. While later history would unfortunately prove that World War I wasn't the war to end all wars, it's still remembered as one of the most brutal conflicts in human history. On one side, the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire, lost an estimated 4 million soldiers. On the other side, the Allies, France, Britain, Russia, and America lost about 6 million. The civilian death toll, meanwhile, was by some estimates as high as 13 million. All in all, the total death toll of the First World War reached approximately 15 to 22 million people. That's more than the entire population of Los Angeles, tragically wiped out over the space of 4 years. While artillery shelling, chemical warfare, and aerial strikes were responsible for their fair share of deaths, many of these deaths were caused by diseases spread by the squalid conditions of trench warfare. All of this is a roundabout way of saying that you probably could not survive a day in World War I. To go into the gory details, and believe us, they are indeed gory, about why, let's start with the most obvious way that you'd be likely to die in the First World War: the weapons. The early 20th century saw huge technological advances in all aspects of life, and warfare was no exception. Even before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which officially started the conflict, smaller territorial conflicts like the Boer War and the Italo-Turkish War, as well as a decade-long Cold War between England and Germany, encouraged the development of never-before-seen methods of destroying the enemy. Let's first look at the machine gun, a vital weapon for infantry combat in the First World War. The first fully functional self-powered machine gun was invented in 1884 by Sir Hiram Maxim. In contrast to the Gatling gun, the Maxim was much lighter, and instead of being hand-powered, it was automatically reloaded using the recoil of the previous bullet it fired. It's no surprise that the Maxim was an instant hit, and by the start of World War I, manufacturers on both sides of the conflict were making gun designs using technology pioneered by the Maxim. Early machine guns were mounted on tripods or wheels and would be operated by soldiers in fortified turrets along the trench lines. These were cumbersome beasts, but what they lacked in portability they made up for in sheer destructive power. The Maxim could fire 600 rounds a minute, with the British-made counterpart, the Vickers machine gun, able to fire 500 rounds a minute. If you, as a soldier, somehow managed to avoid being turned into Swiss cheese by a machine gun turret, you would still need to avoid enemy snipers. Rifles were the most common weapon on the battlefield in the First World War. By 1903, most armies had adopted a new type of rifle with a manually operated locking mechanism and a magazine that allowed soldiers to load 3 and 10 bullets into the rifle before needing to reload. The rifles used in the First World War had a far higher rate of fire than any other guns available to the average infantryman in previous conflicts, with an experienced shooter being able to fire up to 15 rounds a minute. They also used a new type of gunpowder, nitrocellulose or smokeless powder. The lack of visible smoke meant snipers could fire with better visibility and were less likely to give away their position, which made them deadly in long-range combat. It's said that while no battle in the war was decided by riflemen, no battle could have been fought without them. Backing up the turrets and snipers were the artillery. These guns were mounted on wheels and required whole teams of men to operate. Varied in size, but were all incredibly deadly thanks to their high rate of fire and the adoption of high explosive shells. Strategies varied between light and heavy artillery, most of them involving the word barrage. Box barrage, Chinese barrage, creeping barrage, you get the idea. Artillery was mainly used for support and defense, as it was the most reliable way to take out large numbers of troops at once. Artillery was also used to damage defensive structures, and using heavy artillery, explosives could be fired from deep behind the front lines into enemy trenches. But the by far scariest new weapons to debut in the First World War were chemical weapons. Even though the 1899 and 1907 Hague Conventions both categorized the use of asphyxiating gas on the battlefield as a war crime, it didn't stop them from being widely used on both sides. The main purpose of chemical weapons was to incapacitate and kill defensive troops inside trenches. In the early days of the war, chemical weapons contained tear-inducing irritants in such small amounts that they basically amounted to pepper spray. At the time, it was thought to be under the threshold of what the Hague Treaty counted as a gas attack. But after people noticed that these weaker gases weren't that effective, both the Germans and the Brits started to really ramp up their use of chemical bombs. Starting in 1915, the first to be used was chlorine, a deadly gas that causes tissue damage to the throat and lungs and can lead to death by asphyxiation. After being hit with multiple chlorine bombs at the Battle of Ypres, the British retaliated by creating their own chemical weapons program. This was considered a cowardly but necessary move, as the stalemate was so bad that the British were willing to try anything to gain a foothold in German territory. Early tests weren't successful, however. In the Battle of Loos, an attempt to hit the Germans with chlorine backfired when the wind suddenly changed direction and blew the chlorine back toward the British trench lines. Other chlorine canisters didn't release their payload upon impact and were actually saved by the German troops to be thrown back at the British later. As the war went on and technology was refined, even more deadly gases were introduced into the mix. There was phosgene, which, while colorless and less strong-smelling than chlorine, took 24 hours to fully poison its victims. This meant that while phosgene had a higher fatality rate than chlorine, its victims were still able to fight for hours after being exposed to the deadly gas. Phosgene was typically mixed with chlorine to a deadly cocktail called White Star, which was responsible for 85% of deaths from chemical weapons in the war. Then, 1917 saw the introduction of mustard gas. Despite the name, it was actually more of a spray that was released from artillery shells and settled on surfaces as an oily liquid. While not nearly as deadly as chlorine or phosgene, contact with mustard gas was very effective in incapacitating enemy soldiers, as exposure to it caused vomiting, irritation of mucous membranes, painful blisters, and in severe cases, internal bleeding. The worst thing about mustard gas was that once deployed, it would soak into the soil, where it could remain active for days or even months, depending on weather conditions. If you were an average soldier on the Western Front, that is to say fighting in Western Germany, France, Luxembourg, and Belgium, you would most likely be fighting from trenches. A trench was normally about 6 feet deep and 3.5 wide, and was reinforced with barbed wire, sandbags, wooden planks, and sheet metal. This might seem like a less than ideal place to house your troops in a battle, but there's a pretty clear reason why trenches were the way to go. During the early battles of World War I, offensive technology was advancing much faster than the technology needed to move troops from place to place. The tank wouldn't be invented until the war was almost over, so the transport of troops was still mainly limited to trains and horses. In short, you had a lot of people fighting in big open spaces with extremely deadly weapons and no reliable way to get away. So both the Central Powers and the Allies started digging trenches to provide cover for their frontline troops. Trench warfare really came into its own in the race to the sea, when both sides unsuccessfully tried to block each other off before their troops could reach the Belgian coastline. By the end of 1914, both sides had uninterrupted lines of trenches stretching from the English Channel all the way to the Swiss border. By that point, the Western Front was locked in a stalemate. Traditional maneuvers were impossible without suffering massive amounts of casualties. If either army tried to send troops across no man's land into enemy territory, they'd be obliterated. This was especially true for Allied troops, since the Germans had been able to secure the higher ground early in the conflict. A typical day of trench warfare went something like this. Troops would take 4-day shifts on the firing line, and afterwards take shifts in the support position in the trenches. If you were on the front line, you and your comrades would try to move toward enemy territory. You would be spaced widely apart to make it harder for the enemy to take you all out at once, and you would have to move in a zigzag to make yourself a harder target. Soldiers on the front line were in constant danger of being sniped, gunned down, or blown up by artillery bombardment. Even if you weren't directly hit by an artillery shell, the shock waves created by the explosions were powerful enough to give you a concussion, and there was always the risk of catching a piece of shrapnel in one of your vital organs. If you weren't in the firing line and stayed behind in the trenches, you still had to keep your guard up. Other than the risk posed by constant heavy-duty artillery barrages, both sides also had snipers placed at strategic locations, waiting to shoot anyone they saw emerge from the top of the enemy trench. One Allied soldier described an experience that proves just how quick and deadly the German snipers were. During the afternoon, a chap looked over where the trench was shallow and said, "Look, I can see the German line." But that was the last thing he saw. He slumped down in the trench, shot through the brain. If you were in their line of sight for even a second, you had a high chance of meeting your end via German bullet. Most of the time, you couldn't even go out to use the latrine. The bombardment usually slowed down at night as the gunners and snipers lost visibility, but that didn't mean you were completely safe. With nightfall came the risk of trench raiders. Using the darkness for cover, teams of raiders would sneak across no man's land with their faces darkened with soot for camouflage. Depending on the orders from the top, sometimes they only raided a trench to gather intel or steal sensitive documents. Other times they just dropped live grenades into dugouts where enemy troops were sleeping, or worse, pumped the trenches full of poison gas. Even if you could avoid getting hit in a trench raid, you had a second, more insidious enemy down in the trenches. The elements. In some ways, the trenches of the Western Front were preferable to the Asian and North African battlefields, as soldiers on the Western Front could take advantage in lulls in enemy bombardment to visit nearby towns and stock up on supplies. In 1916, France experienced its rainiest autumn in over 30 years, which dashed any positive opinions anybody might have had on the Western Front. Since much of their plant life around the battlefields would have been long destroyed by bombs and artillery shelling, the upturned soil of no man's land quickly turned into an impassable muddy marsh. The trenches themselves were extremely susceptible to flooding, and there was no reliable way to drain the water out. This also made the trenches a breeding ground for disease. That's what happens when you have a bunch of men sleeping in the mud together within spitting distance of a bunch of dead bodies. Rats were a constant problem, as were lice, and bites from both facilitated the spread of a nasty condition called the trench fever. Trench fever wasn't fatal, but it was extremely infectious, with a long incubation period and a high rate of reinfection in those who already had it. The amount of stagnant, muddy water in the trenches didn't help things either. It made injured soldiers susceptible to infections, and standing around in all that water led to developing trench foot. Trench foot, which was also known as jungle rot in Vietnam, is a type of severe tissue damage caused by having body parts submerged in water for extended periods of time. It's very similar to frostbite, only wetter and about 1,000 times more gross. In extreme cases, the tissue would become so rotten and infected that sufferers would need to have the infected foot amputated completely. If the Western Front sounds a little grim for you, maybe you'd rather take your chances in one of the other theaters of war. After all, you only ever seem to hear about the Western Front, so the other fronts must not have been as bad, right? Unfortunately, that is not the case, as the battles on the Eastern Front were just as deadly, if not more so. The conflict on the Eastern Front was fought mainly between Austria and Russia. Now, Russia was already not doing so well when the war broke out, though the Allies put their faith in Russia's superior manpower to defend the Eastern Front. The truth was that Russia was the least technologically advanced of the great European powers. They didn't have nearly enough infrastructure or manufacturing capabilities to transport and arm their troops as quickly as Germany or the Ottomans did. Though the Russians were able to gather an army of 5 million, they didn't have nearly enough rifles for everyone. Their military was woefully underfunded and suffered from poorly organized leadership. Tsar Nicholas, Russia's supreme emperor, had way more institutional power than he did military know-how, leading to the Tsar and his top commanders often butting heads over strategy. This clash of personalities meant the Russian soldiers were slow to receive orders. On top of that, their allies in France and Britain struggled to send them supplies due to, of all things, differences in the way Russian train tracks were laid. In pretty much every other country, the tracks were laid with 4 foot 8 inches of space between them. But in Russia, they have an even 5 feet between them. That might not seem like a lot, but it is enough to cause serious delays in transporting rations, medical supplies, ammunition, men, or basically anything between Russia and the rest of Europe. That was bad news for Russia, since their army was hemorrhaging troops left and right, and they really needed support. Russia lost 5% of its male population over the course of the war, which is a similar percentage to England, but considering how much bigger Russia was, it added up to a staggering loss figure. The losses got so bad that in the later stages of the war, Russia started enlisting women as well, in an effort to boost national morale. As bad as soldiers had it, prisoners of war on the Eastern Front had it worse. Germans and Austrians captured behind enemy lines were forced to build canals and railroads and were subject to malnutrition, scurvy, and exhaustion due to food shortages. Malaria was also extremely common in the summer months. When the German and Austrian governments caught wind of these horrific conditions, they complained to the Russians, who refused to acknowledge the complaints at first. As with a lot of problems in Russia, the poor treatment of POWs was mostly down to dwindling resources and bureaucratic infighting. It's really no wonder that these guys had a huge revolution toward the end of the war. The Eastern Front battles took place over much more widespread areas, with more space for troops to maneuver, so trenches weren't as common as they were in the West. You might be tempted to think that the less crowded, less wet living spaces meant that diseases was less of an issue on the Eastern Front, but you'd be wrong. Disease was actually worse on the Eastern Front, with malaria, cholera, dysentery, typhus, and other illnesses accounting for around 4 times the number of deaths that were caused by actual combat. This is because while the battles of the Western Front mainly took place in wide-open fields, a lot more fighting on the Eastern Front took place in major cities of Poland, Romania, Lithuania, and other countries bordering or within the Russian Empire. Soldiers on the Eastern Front came in closer contact with civilians, meaning they had more opportunities to catch diseases, which would then spread from city to city as refugees fled from the carnage in large numbers. The deaths by disease got so bad that the German army started a large-scale sanitation program in every city they occupied. They quarantined neighborhoods with high rates of disease, started mandatory lice checks at military bathhouses, and even established sanitation police to inspect the cleanliness of homes and businesses. So the fighting was brutal no matter which front you were on. But that's just the army. What did naval battles look like in World War I? Two major players in the naval conflict of World War I were Britain and Germany, who had been in a naval arms race for over a decade before the war broke out. The main type of battleship that dominated naval warfare in the early days of the war was the dreadnought. British dreadnoughts were well armed but deliberately lacked armor in order to increase speed. The idea was that they'd be faster than any ship that was bigger than them and better armed than any ship that was smaller. German dreadnoughts, in contrast, were slower but far more damage resistant. However, neither type of dreadnought was especially well equipped to deal with attacks from torpedo boats. Submarines began to see use around this time as well, but they were imprecise with limited range and were more effective at taking out supply ships than surface warships. That being said, German U-boats did manage to take out a few smaller British ships. The Navy had it a bit easier than the Army on both sides, as they saw comparatively little combat. But even when they weren't engaged in battle, conditions were less than ideal. One account from a German naval officer in 1914 describes life on a U-boat as incredibly claustrophobic. The batteries which powered the sub's electricity were kept dangerously close to the ventilation intake, and whenever the men wanted to load a torpedo into the tube, all the furniture had to be moved out of the commanding officer's quarters to make room for it. It was so bad that some men on the sub started taking opium on longer missions just to help them keep their cool. On the other side of the war, British commander Arthur Bond's account of life on the HMS Swan describes the experience as being akin to living in an oven. Meat would spoil easily, ice melted immediately, and all the drinking water was warm. Other officers on similar battleships described cockroach infestation and a pervasive layer of grime and soot over everything due to most of the British ships still using coal power at this period of time. Another big danger for those serving in the Navy was underwater mines. These were mainly placed along coastlines in order to stop boats from getting close enough to conduct coastal bombardments or complete supply runs. The first battleship sunk during the war, the HMS Audacious, was sunk by a naval mine on October 27, 1914. In addition to the Navy and the Army, World War I saw the introduction of a new element to warfare: aerial attacks. The first people to make use of airships for war were the Italians, back in the Italo-Turkish War of 1911. During Italy's assault on Libya, Zeppelins were used to bomb Turkish positions, marking the first ever use of aerial bombardment in history. 4 years later, in 1915, the Germans used Zeppelins to bomb both military and civilian targets in London and Paris. Thankfully, the casualties were minimal, but later air raids would become more destructive. One of the worst raids was one that occurred in 1915, when a single German Zeppelin killed 22 people and extensively damaged surrounding buildings. Zeppelins were highly effective in stealth raids as they made very little noise, but they were also slow and full of highly explosive hydrogen gas, two facts that made them easy targets for anti-aircraft shelling. Even outside of battles, the war caused thousands of indirect casualties in countries that were nowhere near either front and really weren't all that involved in the war. Food shortages hit hard during the war years, and as this was the age of colonialism, imperial forces fighting the wars would make up for these food shortages by redirecting supplies from their colonies. In British-controlled East Africa, conscription of farm labor led to a famine in 1917. And German soldiers in Africa frequently stole cattle from African civilians. African men were also recruited as carriers for the colonial armies. By 1917, 1 million African subjects from the colonies had been conscripted by the British, and as many as 95,000 had died. Exact numbers of African civilian deaths are hard to get, as they were considered less important than European deaths. One colonial office bureaucrat summed up the attitude of the time pretty succinctly when he wrote, "Who cares about the native carriers?" Even after the war was over, its effects were felt for decades after. Troops returning from the front brought the deadly Spanish flu pandemic with them, which killed even more people in the coming years. Russia's Tsar was overthrown by a population who saw his poor management of the First War as the final straw. Germany's economy and infrastructure were gutted by the Versailles Treaty, leading to civil unrest that then paved the way for the Nazi Party to gain power. Parts of Europe were rendered barren for decades afterwards by shelling and chemical bombs. Even the people who survived were fundamentally changed in a way that soldiers in previous wars had not been. So if you think you could survive all that, well, we admire your confidence and we'll send flowers to your relatives. Now watch why the trenches were the most dangerous job in World War I, or check out this video instead.